I once had the great pleasure of introducing Louis Menand for a talk, much like this, in a room much like this, to an audience much like this. What a great fellow he is. He's a terrific guy and a wonderful scholar. And I mention that because the question I had in mind when I walked up here was, who has written the most talked about book in this area, maybe in higher education, maybe beyond higher education, the past year? I don't know. Who do you think? Anyone around? I don't know. Who's written the most talked about book? Well, maybe our next keynote speaker has, actually. It's really a distinct pleasure and a great honor to introduce to you Roosevelt Montas, who, as you know, is a senior lecturer in American Studies and English at Columbia University, where he also earned his degrees in English and comparative literature, including his doctorate, which was recognized as the 2004 Bancroft Award recipient for, which I think is kind of important. Yeah, I think it is. And where at Columbia University, Dr. Montas has served as the director of the Center for the Core Curriculum in the college from 2008 to 2018, a very great deal of service in that role. And where he was, when he was a graduate student, recognized with the Presidential Award for Outstanding Teaching, and where he currently teaches Introduction to Contemporary Civilization in the West, which is a year-long course, primary texts, and more on political thought, as well as seminars in American Studies, which include seminar on freedom and citizenship in the United States. He is also the director of the Center for American Studies Freedom and Citizenship Program in collaboration with Double Discovery Center. You know, he's written this book that you may have read or certainly read about, if not yet read, called Rescuing Socrates: How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter for a New Generation, which was published last year by Princeton University Press. And it's such a great turn of events that Roosevelt Montas is able to be here today to pick up on the themes that Dr. DeBanco introduced to us, expand on them, and provide his perspective on the vital importance of core curricula, which he may know more about than practically anyone, and with a special attention to the fact that he himself has experienced this and it's helped change his life. So would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Roosevelt Montas.
Thank you, Stephen, for that very generous introduction. It's a real honor for me to be here and to be part of this conversation. Sitting at my table and hearing Professor DeBanco's remarks and the conversation at my table, one of the things that came to the fore that's kind of highlighted for me, something that it's evident to all of us, but it's just the conversation kind of put a big highlight on it, is just how imperiled the very idea of liberal education that we care about is in the contemporary university. And in so many ways, so many of the problems and the thorny issues that come up in questions that we talk about at the table are all symptomatic of a real threat and retrenchment of the idea of liberal education at the university. So the work that we're doing here and the conversations that we're having are all more important today probably than they have ever been. A few preliminaries. I want to apologize because I'm going to have to head out shortly after I speak. My wife last night came home with what turned out to be a stomach flu, and our 4-year-old woke up this morning with the stomach flu. So they are kind of can hardly get up. So I need to go and do some rescuing in my own household. So I really apologize for that. it's a very bad look to just come and speak, give a keynote address and leave. And I really apologize. There are a lot of reasons why I would want to be here for the whole conversation. It's just the fact that we are embodied beings and embedded beings sometimes just intrudes in a hard way. So I apologize. So there's a lot that has already been said, both by Professor Del Banco and in the discussions at the table. And there's a lot that's already understood about liberal education in the research university. It's not a new topic or a recent topic or an obscure topic. So Professor Del Banco and I did not coordinate, but much of what is said, I think, lays the large framework in which I'm going to speak. In fact, you can think of much of what I say today as footnotes to Professor Del Banco's address. So, I don't think I'm going to say anything that's new to you. And if you allow me, what I'd like to do is to highlight some aspects of what has already been understood and what has already been said. And I hope we leave a lot of time for discussion. When I see on a schedule a whole hour in which I'm supposed to speak, it's always intimidating. And I end up saying, I'm just going to say some general things and leave room for a lot of discussion. So that was the plan that I had today. Although after I heard the questions that Professor Del Banco faced, it's made me rethink leaving a lot of time for discussion, but we'll see. The first thing I would emphasize is that the project of liberal education is not primarily epistemological. It is not about adding new knowledge to a previous stock. It is not the relay race model that Professor Del Banco alluded to. The project of liberal education is primarily ethical in ways that I hope to explain in a moment. And to the extent that liberal education might be thought of as an epistemological project, it concerns a type of knowledge that the ancient Greeks, you see there's a lot in Plato and Aristotle, called phronesis, which is often translated as prudence or practical wisdom or even practical virtue. It is a kind of knowledge that sometimes is contrasted with theoretical knowledge, but it also bears contrast with a kind of knowledge that has been ascendant since the 17th century and which dominates in the research enterprise of the university. As a shorthand, we can call that knowledge scientific knowledge. There's a slide, liberal knowledge versus scientific knowledge. All of my slides will be in this genre. Phronesis is the kind of knowledge that the liberal arts are concerned with. It is not a true opposite of scientific knowledge. It actually incorporates and absorbs scientific knowledge. It needs it involves sound judgment, which is impossible apart from the rigor and precision of scientific knowledge. But phronesis also involves excellence of character, a kind of affective disposition that includes antiquated notions like virtue, integrity, and humility. Phronesis is concerned with how to live, how to proceed in the absence of certainty, how to behave in the face of incalculability. And that's why the colleague that Professor Del Banco referenced, who I take to be Roger Lajeca, says this thing: if you the grade that you get really should be an incomplete, because it is how you live your life that determines the success or failure of what we're doing here. And it's also what makes assessment so problematic at the end of the semester. And it's really, assessment in the liberal arts is the most difficult aspect of its administration. One wants to just throw it overboard and say, forget it, but one can't, because this can be done well and it can be done poorly. And it behooves us to figure out how it's done well and what makes it being done well. On the other hand, we are threatened by Assessment people talk about Goodhart's law, which is the kind of bon mot that when a measurement becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measurement. So whenever we introduce the targets and the measurements, and grades is the first instance of this. When getting an A becomes a target for the student, then the thing that the A is supposed to do, the thing that the A is supposed to measure, becomes less important, less relevant. The A becomes less good at measuring the thing it's supposed to measure. So when we introduce assessment protocols, they easily threaten to take over the entire activity. So it's a very tricky issue. Now, since I don't speak Greek, I'm going to stop using the term phronesis and instead just talk about liberal knowledge. The English mathematician Alfred North Whitehead invoked a distinction similar to the one I am drawing when he distinguished between the speculative reason, which he says Plato shared with God, and the pragmatic reason, which Ulysses shared with the foxes. Liberal knowledge is earthly and rooted in the contingencies and dilemmas of life. It involves foresight as well as intuition, calculation as well as value judgment, clarity as well as ambiguity, explicitness as well as elusiveness. Scientific knowledge, as Professor Del Banco emphasized, progresses cumulatively. It builds on the discoveries of the past and adds new ones on top of those. We understand infectious disease, electromagnetic radiation, and climate change much better than we did 50 years ago. And we call this progress. But liberal knowledge doesn't quite progress that way. We don't understand the experience of grief, or how to live with the consciousness of death, or the meaning of love and nobility any better today than we did 100 years ago. In fact, some people would say that we understand it less well today. The latest war novel is not an improvement on the Iliad. The same goes for art. Warhol and Rothko are not superior to Michelangelo and Renoir. Art doesn't get better as time goes on. Here's a dictum from the Zen master Shunryu Suzuki that points towards the kind of things that concerns liberal knowledge. The most important thing is to find out what is the most important thing. Liberal learning integrates knowing, doing, and being. The question of ultimates is always in view. What really matters? And those questions always resolve to what kind of life is truly worth living? What is worth striving for? What is worth wanting? And you all work with undergraduates, so you know that these questions are alive and urgent for them. It is not true that undergraduates just come to college looking to find a way to get a job. We tell them that's what college should be for, but they are suspicious. And if you give them something upon which to hang that suspicion, they will embrace it with the kind of existential urgency that we remember feeling at that age. There's a scene, this may be hokey, but there's a scene in the movie Malcolm X, where Malcolm X goes to meet with Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, into which he has converted into Islam, and he's kind of an apprentice, and he gets out of prison. He converts in prison, he's out. He's of course going to become the minister and a spokesman for the Reverend Elijah Muhammad. And I don't know if this happened in real life, but in the movie, I also read the autobiography, but I also saw the movie. This is not in the autobiography, but it's in the movie. The Reverend Elijah Muhammad, when he visits him, has a pitcher of water and some glasses on the table. And he takes a glass of water and pours a pitcher of clear water. And then he takes an ink stand and he pours some ink into the water. And so you see the ink kind of spreading and tainting the water. And he says, if you give a hungry person, a thirsty person, this water, they will drink it. And then he pours another glass. I said, but if you give them a choice, they're going to choose the clear water. And I think what has happened in our undergraduate curricula is that we have not given students a choice. We have not given students the opportunity to have a real liberal arts experience. And therefore, they're flocking away from it, because who wants that if what you want to do is study biology or engineering or whatever? The case of the Cornerstone program at Purdue and the many programs have been modeled on that is a testament to the fact that when you do offer students a real liberal arts experience, they will want it, they will drink it. So liberal knowledge is not divorced from how one lives in the world, from action that grows out of the values and insights that one gains. And liberal education implies constant examination of the deep sources of our motivation and of our desires. So liberal knowledge, practical wisdom or prudence or judgment, is ground that is always shifting, always unfolding in ways we can't anticipate. It is a field where doubt and intuition are as important as proof and certainty. Another way to think about this kind of knowledge I am calling liberal is to call it ethical knowledge. And this connection between ethics and freedom is quite intuitive to us. Kant describes it quite brilliantly when he says in the groundwork of metaphysics, for the metaphysics of morals, that the science of the laws of nature is called physics, whereas the science of the laws of freedom is called ethics. Let me elaborate that a little bit. It's quite a penetrating observation. First of all, ethical behavior is not random, nor is free behavior random. That is, free behavior is not chaotic, it is not erratic. It is in fact organized, but it's organized by laws of freedom. And that laws is those laws are what Kant calls ethics. Here's an example that illustrates just how intuitive this is. Imagine that you're walking on the street and you see somebody who's evidently in a hurry, kind of just walking very fast and visibly in a rush. And there is some person who's struggling to cross the street, an elderly person, a disabled person, someone who's just having trouble getting across. And this person who's in a hurry stops, goes back a few steps, takes this person who needs help crossing the street, gets them over to the other side, and then returns and continues on his journey or her journey. So you might look at that and say, oh, there's an action that has ethical worth, that has ethical value. But then imagine that you learn that this individual who did that committed some terrible crime in the past, and their punishment is that whenever they see somebody struggling to cross the street, they have to stop and help them, no matter how much of a hurry they are, how urgent their situation. If you then learn that person is in fact under compulsion to do what he or she did, somehow the same action loses its ethical shine. Somehow it loses its ethical worth. Now, of course, if you are a strict utilitarian, you might say no, it's the same issue. But I think it's intuitive to us that those are fundamentally different situations, because it's intuitive to us to think of morality and ethical behavior as an expression of our freedom. And when ethical behavior or ethical actions are not an expression of our freedom, somehow their ethical status is compromised. So back to the point that I started with, that liberal education is not primarily an epistemological project, but an ethical one. It concerns the laws of freedom. That's why it is properly called liberal education. And that's why I prefer that term, despite its baggage, to other less loaded terms. And it's also why I always like to talk about the practice of liberal education, not the theory of liberal education. Because liberal education is a practice. It is in some way a decidedly, entrenchedly anti-theoretical activity. It is concerned with questions that the activity of living a human life inevitably involves. So liberal education is about the formation and the cultivation of human beings. Knowledge, information, facts, skills, critical thinking, all of those are involved. But they come in not as aims in themselves, but as tools and instruments for an aim that is of an altogether different sort. An aim that has to do with the subjective quality of whole lives, an aim which cannot be boiled down to determinate formulation, and which therefore is rather hard to measure. If liberal education is aptly named, so is the research university. Its primary function is research. Its modus operandi is adding new knowledge to a previous stock and eventually translating that knowledge into improving the world. And I don't need to persuade you all the obvious ways in which our world has been improved by this activity. In the research university, however, liberal education is suspect. It's suspect in just the way that Socrates' activity in Athens was suspect. Because if the research university tries to build knowledge that is eventually useful for improving the world, liberal education asks about what counts as improvement. Progress? Progress towards what? Efficiency? Efficiency of what? Life extension? Sure, but how does one live a meaningful, long life? And do we have responsibilities to future generations that are compromised by indefinite life extension? Liberal education asks questions that the research enterprise suspends in order to conduct its research. But of course, it is absolutely necessary that those questions be raised. I'm reminded of a story by the physicist Robert Wilson, who was director of the Fermi National Laboratory. He was testifying before Congress in 1969, and he was asked how the lab's particle accelerator would be of use for national defense. And the story goes that Robert Wilson said that the lab would be among the things that make the country worth defending. That's the liberal answer. It's not valuable because it is useful. It is valuable precisely because it's separate from its instrumentality. The research university has been organized to streamline the epistemological mission of knowledge generation, accumulation, and dissemination. Its paradigmatic mode of knowledge is scientific, experimental, codifiable, repeatable, verifiable, refutable. The kind of knowledge that can be put into a graph and which ultimately in its purest form can be expressed in mathematical terms. You know, exactitude. Ever since Descartes, this is what counts as knowledge, clear and direct perception. As Stephen said in his introduction, I was director of Columbia's Center for the Core Curriculum for 10 years. And one of the things I did there, I thought a lot about assessment and how to go about this. And one of the attempts, one of the projects I did was organize a series of focus groups with students at different stages of their college career, with faculty at different stages of their career as well, tenure track as well as tenured faculty and full-time faculty who are not on the tenure track. And then with alumni from different generations, 5 and 10 years out, just groups that were kind of loose conversations. And I didn't do this, researchers came and conducted the semi-structured interviews, took detailed notes, and then compressed the notes into these just beautiful reports about what it meant for people, what it means for students, what it means for a first-year student, what it means for a senior, what it means for a student who's 5 years out, for a student who is 30 years out, and of course, what it means for faculty at the beginning of their career, at the end of their career. And the thing that struck me is that anyone who sits down with any one of these 20, 30-page single-space reports and read those accounts, those narratives, would be profoundly moved and persuaded of the value of what we're doing and of the effectiveness of what we're doing. But put that stuff into a graph. Show that stuff in a slide presentation to a trustee meeting. You can't. So it's part of the problem, part of the difficulty. Yet those are precisely the people whom we have to convince, whom we have to persuade and justify the existence of and the investments that liberal education requires. Because of course, liberal education, because by its nature, is not cost neutral and is not cheap either. You know, I I've now had several occasions to say that the idea that education should be cost efficient is ridiculous, but we just kind of assume it. It should be, we just drive for cost efficiency in education. No. It's like thinking about cooking as packing the maximum number of calories per bite. That's not what you're after. Now, I do not gainsay scientific knowledge. I'm rather a fan, and in an earlier incarnation of myself, I wanted to be a biologist. So I don't question or challenge the primacy of scientific knowledge in our world and its centrality in the university. I think that's appropriate. But there are a great many things, human things, that are resistant to this kind of determinate understanding and representation, things that resist codification. When the questions before us concern things like justice, the good, the beautiful, the very questions that ground and orient our existence, then technical knowledge is of limited use. To situate ourselves before the basic dilemmas of human life, to navigate our inner worlds, we have to call on capacities and intuitions that have as much to do with intellect as they do with character. We have to call precisely on those capacities that qualify us as free and moral agents, irreducible to calculation. It's worth remembering that universities were established in an environment of information scarcity. You remember when it was a thing to have access to a university library. President Banco was upset that the library was closed because he wanted to go and do research there. And when he was telling the story, like, you couldn't just do it in the computer, right? Because now the library is no longer the repository of knowledge where you go and you get it. People used to, choose what city they were going to live or what job they were going to get based on access to the kind of based on the kind of access they would have to what kind of library. But we're in a different world now, and it has happened very fast. The least thing that our students need is to be given information. The biggest thing that they need is some way of judging what information matters and what doesn't, what information is worth giving attention to. Attention, not information, is now the scarce resource. Students need to educate their attention. Liberal education works by reorienting attention. It uses information, but what matters is the direction toward which the student's attention is turned. That is, liberal education works on the affective disposition of the student. You might remember this quote from Plato's Republic. It's a little bit long, and I'll read it out loud. Education isn't what some people declare it to be, namely putting knowledge into souls that lack it, like putting sight into blind eyes. But our present discussion, on the other hand, shows that the power to learn is present in everyone's soul, and that the instrument with which each learns is like an eye that cannot be turned from darkness to light without turning the whole body. Then education, and Plato's talking about liberal education, he probably would have called it philosophic education. Then education is the craft concerned with doing this very thing, this turning around, and with how the soul can most easily and effectively be made to do it. It isn't the craft of putting sight into the soul. Education takes for granted that sight is there, but that it isn't turned the right way or looking where it ought to look, and tries to redirect it appropriately. I think Plato was on to this issue of education having to do with the training and redirection of students' attention. Little did he know what was coming. Although, if you read Plato's Phaedrus, he has very big concerns about what writing is going to do to human cognition and to the mind. So another way of saying what Plato is after in this quote is that liberal education concerns with the redirection of the student's affective disposition. That is, that liberal education is about teaching students how to organize their freedom, teaching them to discern what objects are most worthy of attention. And of course, this necessarily involves the question of value. We're having a conversation at our table where the fact came up that in the liberal arts, there is a pervasive intellectual orientation that denies the possibility of hierarchical assignment of value, of things that are better than others, things that are more true, or things that are true, things that are virtuous, things that are good. In my view, you cannot have liberal education absent a commitment, absent the possibility of rational investigation into questions of the human good, including questions like virtue and truth. So teaching students to what objects are most worthy of their attention. Of course, teaching is maybe the wrong word. You don't tell them what it is. You engage them in a process. You engage them in a reorientation of attention. Doing that involves having some values that are higher than others, some objects of contemplation and debate and reflection that are especially suitable for the task of liberal education. So liberal education is necessarily also an education in values. It is not that liberal education tells students what is right and wrong. That would no longer be liberal education, but indoctrination. Liberal education teaches students how to think and investigate in a values-conscious way. It lives in the questions. The ground it occupies is the ground of indeterminacy. It is this very quality of indeterminacy that characterizes the human condition of freedom. We often, traditional, philosophic debates oppose free will versus determinism, because it is that quality of indeterminacy that characterizes our freedom. We simply cannot know, in the scientific sense, what we most desire to know. But this is also the condition of human freedom. In Plato's early dialogue, the Euthyphro, Socrates identifies the soul's capacity for self-activity as the ground for this indeterminacy or its freedom. Here's another quote, also a bit long. I'll read it. It's just a dialogue between Socrates and Euthyphro. Euthyphro is a kind of a priest kind of figure who's supposed to be an expert in questions of piety and religious duty. And this whole dialogue is about the nature of piety or of moral rectitude. So Socrates asks, what are the subjects of difference that cause hatred and anger? Let us look at it this way. If you and I were to differ about numbers as to which is the greater, would this difference make us enemies and angry with each other? Or would we proceed to count and soon resolve the difference about this? We would certainly do so. Again, if we differed about the larger and the smaller, we would turn to measurement and soon cease to differ. That is so. And about the heavier and the lighter, we would resort to weighing and be reconciled. Of course. What subject of difference would make us angry and hostile to each other if we were unable to come to a decision? Perhaps you do not have an answer ready, but examine, as I tell you, whether these subjects are the just and the unjust, the beautiful and the ugly, the good and the bad. Are these not the subjects of difference about which, when we are unable to come to a satisfactory decision, you and I and other men become hostile to each other wherever we do? In other words, subjects that are not amenable to this kind of measurement and quantification. Whereas we can attain knowledge of determinate knowledge of things that we can measure and quantify, what Socrates called questions of the larger and the smaller, the heavier and the lighter. When we turn to matters of the soul, the just and the unjust, the beautiful and the ugly, the good and the bad, the soul's capacity for self-motion, its freedom, makes these subjects resistant to the kind of determinate knowledge available to empirical investigation. So another way to describe liberal arts is to say that they deal with questions of the human soul. And by human soul, I mean an entity that is conscious of itself, that is conscious of itself as free and self-determining. And we don't need to get into the question of whether we are actually free and self-determining. We are constrained, and our freedom is qualified and conditioned in all kinds of ways. But suffice it to say that the soul experiences itself as free. That is, that we, each of us, experiences him or herself as a free agent. But I need to stress the following point. The fact that the field with which the liberal arts concern themselves is not the proper object of scientific knowledge does not mean that one doesn't learn anything in the liberal arts. But there is a distinct way in which you learn something liberally. To learn something liberally means that you take an interest in the process of learning itself, and that you come to understand the thing that is learned in a larger context. You understand not only what is being learned, but also why it is being learned. Not only how something works, but what it means for it to work in the way that it does. One of the characteristics of liberal knowledge is that the learning is not just added on top of a previous stock of knowledge. When you learn something liberally, it rearranges everything else that you know. You don't just end up with more knowledge, but with a different configuration of knowledge. Properly speaking, liberal knowledge is always transformative. It always involves some degree of reconfiguration of the soul. I can summarize all this by saying that the knowledge mission of the research university, in as much as it is organized around a paradigm of knowledge that doesn't transfer over into liberal learning, creates a problematic and sometimes outright hostile environment for the practice of liberal education in the university. As I said at the beginning, this has been well understood, though perhaps one is not used to hearing it put in the stark terms that I am using. One way to track the relationship between liberal education and the research university is to look at the relationship in the American case of the university as a whole and the undergraduate colleges it often contains. And I guess I should come right out and say that, in my view, liberal education in the university is really an undergraduate issue. Even if you are in a so-called liberal arts field, when we talk about graduate school, we're now mainly concerned with professional training, specialized research methods, and bodies of scholarship. It's not that liberal education can't happen in graduate school, but that its natural home and function within the university falls naturally to the undergraduate division, and especially to that part of the undergraduate curriculum that we call general education. In general education, the idea of education as not subordinated to any particular major or specialized pursuit remains. It is the place where we still imagine a tranche of the curriculum that applies equally to every student by virtue of their humanity, not by virtue of their major or professional aspiration. Many of the leading universities in the United States emerged from all colleges that were dedicated to the training of young men for various forms of leadership. That mission, focused on raising and reproducing a cultural elite, is of course one we've gradually come to reject. And I'll make a side note here to say that it is no small achievement, as imperiled as the idea is today, to uphold higher education as a democratic institution that ought to be open and accessible to any individual who wishes to pursue it. That's an extraordinary achievement in the United States. That is that idea. It is, of course, an idea that is losing ground. We are failing and, in fact, reversing our aspiration to make college a real possibility for everyone. And at the same time, we have offered less and less a vision of liberal education, even as colleges has been opened to more and more people. So many of these early American colleges that were dedicated to the cultivation of young men for social leadership became enveloped in much larger institutional enterprise whose mission was much broader. Echoing the ancient myth of Oedipus, the college gave birth to the university, and the university has ever since been trying to kill it. At Columbia, and Tito Banco mentioned additional instances of this trend that I'm about to point out. At Columbia, President A.P. Barnard proposed outright in 1889 that the undergraduate college be abolished. Though the motion failed before the trustees, Columbia College has faced repeated attempts at its dissolution as Columbia University has taken shape and become dominant around it. At about the same time as A.P. Barnard said that, over at Harvard, President Charles W. Eliot was weighing the advice of historian Edward Channing, who proposed that the college, quote, the college ought to be suppressed or moved out into the country where it would not interfere with the proper work of the university. Over at the University of Chicago, as Robert Hutchins acknowledged in his 1929 inaugural address, members of the faculty, this is a quote, members of the faculty have urged that we withdraw from undergraduate work, or at least the first 2 years of it. Johns Hopkins, which was founded in 1876 and is widely recognized as the first fully developed American research university, was initially conceived without an undergraduate college at all. So there are other examples that illustrate that while many colleges live within universities and do gain extraordinary advantages from them, the two institutions have always been singing a different tune, with the university as a center of research and innovation, and the college as a center of teaching and self-actualization. Columbia College Dean Herbert Hawks, and this might have been the dean that Andy Delbanco quoted, said in 1922 that the student is the focus of the undergraduate college, with an implicit contrast to the university, where the focus is the subject or the academic discipline. And I will take the liberty to quote Professor Delbanco from his extraordinary book on the American college. He puts it succinctly that the former, the college, is about transmitting knowledge of and from the past to undergraduate students so they may draw upon it as a living resource in the future. The latter, the university, is mainly an array of research activities conducted by faculty and graduate students with the aim of creating new knowledge in order to supersede the past. So while the American college continues to be a central and defining feature of the American research university, liberal education within the college has not fared well in the last half century. The research ideal that dominates the university has extended even to the practice of liberal education. Academic careers, even in the liberal arts, as all of you well know, are made through research, with monographs, articles, and conference papers serving as the primary measures of professional merit. One of the results of this system of professional incentives is the production in the liberal arts disciplines of ever larger quantities of published research for ever narrower audiences. In the sciences, the research ideal has generally led to more effective accumulation and dissemination of knowledge. In the humanities and the humanistic social sciences, it has generally meant fragmentation and irrelevance, withdrawal from the human questions that breathe life and meaning to the liberal arts. Because these questions are only marginally susceptible to scientific investigation, the research orientation of the academic profession ensures that they are largely ignored. It's true that nearly all undergraduate programs will require a number of general education courses for the bachelor's degree. But when you scratch beneath the surface of the catalog descriptions, you typically find departmental courses rooted in disciplinary specializations, with perhaps some tweaks here and there to justify their being offered as general education. But true general education has been virtually squeezed out of the curriculum by the dominance of disciplinary specialization and the organization of universities into corresponding academic departments. Many colleges now think about liberal education simply as exposure to a range of academic disciplines, turning their general education requirements into a prescription for how many and how varied a set of academic disciplines a student must sample before graduation. But in important ways, liberal education is necessarily non-disciplinary. As Jacques Barzun pointed out after a lifetime in both liberal education and university administration, to be of any worth, the liberal arts must be taught as arts, not as scholarly disciplines. And that must be done by teachers. The present system, which favors faculty research over teaching, turns the liberal arts into professional subjects. Liberal education begins from the premise that the fundamental issues at stake in education are not scholarly, but existential. That, as I said earlier, its basic mission is not epistemological, but ethical. This does not negate the fact that a good part of a college education, especially today, must concern itself with preparing economically productive individuals who can perform specialized functions in society. But that's not the soul of the college. The idea of an undergraduate college is of a space of exploration and development that is insulated from the economic and technological forces that shape and distort our social institutions. Of course, the idea of a non-practical education can sound very strange today. It's an idea that is profoundly at odds with the market values that dominate in our culture. Every summer, when I teach low-income high school students, I get puzzled looks when I first propose that the point of college isn't to prepare them to get good jobs. Many students and their families can't imagine what else could possibly be the point. I confess that it is hard to tell them what the point is. It is, in fact, almost impossible to communicate the meaning of a liberal education through arguments and admonitions. The difficulty is compounded when students come to college looking to escape poverty and marginality. But what works with everyone else is what works with low-income high school students: doing liberal education. Contagion is the only effective method of communicating the value of a liberal education. The process is one of transmission rather than instruction. After 3 weeks in which we meet for 2 hours each day to discuss ancient, Enlightenment, and contemporary philosophical texts, I don't have to tell these disadvantaged students about the value of a liberal education. They know. They have had an experience that cannot be easily summarized, packaged, or reduced to instrumental value. They have certainly acquired new skills and accumulated a lot of new knowledge. But more importantly, they have tapped into inner capacities that will inform their entire lives beyond our class. Not only what they learn and what they do, but who they become. My point here, and with this I will end, is that the research ideal is of limited value in undergraduate general education, and its dominance in the university and in the academic profession has been detrimental to liberal education. In fact, a good deal of the contemporary crisis in the liberal arts stems from the institutional and professional landscape in which they operate. Okay, thank you. Easy questions, please.
Just 2 or 3, would that be all right?
Sure,
A
yes.
few only easy questions, please. Yes, please.
So I'm not sure if my question is a question or a comment or a plea for help. So I'm just gonna start with that. So I am committed to and convinced by the liberal education. I understand that assessment is difficult. What I'm trying to grapple with is this breakdown that happens when we talk to students and we talk to alumni. We can see the value of what we are doing in general education and liberal education. But then I despair when I look out into the world and I see that we have such ripe ground for systemic oppression and discrimination and violence, and that those same people who are perpetrating those things were also a product of institutions in many instances that also had these liberal opportunities, as liberal education opportunities. So then I go, well, maybe the assessment is actually, maybe what we are learning is that we are not doing the thing that we think we are doing when we do our focus groups 5 years, 10 years, 30 years out. And I'm just not sure how to navigate that space, that breakdown between what we know in our hearts to be true, what we understand when we do certain kinds of assessments, and then when we kind of try to extrapolate that and place it on the broader context of the global scene.
Great. That's a really great question. I have a couple of things to say. So one is, when you look out there into the social landscape and you see all these not only opportunities, but actual systematic forms of exclusion and oppression and exploitation, what you're seeing is a failure of liberal education. That is, what you're seeing is we have not, let me put it this way, you cannot have a democracy. You cannot have a democracy that upholds and enacts the values of equality and freedom to which a liberal democracy is ostensibly committed to, without a liberally educated population. And not only the persistence of oppression is the unfinished work of liberal education, or perhaps the badly done work of liberal education. But also there are our current political polarization and the kind of a sclerotic condition of our political discourse, where we can't get anything or hardly anything done. The other thing that's important to say is that even our most elite institutions have not been doing the work of liberal education that I'm describing here. You can get a liberal education. There are some pathways that you can organize to do it, but usually the people that have the cultural capital to seek that out are the people who least need it. You're right that our public life, including some of its ugliest aspects, it's rife with people who are graduates of the most elite institutions. The Trump administration, which sometimes is seen as a kind of populist revolt, it's a kind of man of the people, a person who came into office to represent the interests of people who are not in the elite classes that dominate the politics. If you look at his cabinet, it was studded with Ivy League graduates, including himself, remarkably. But the point is that even our most elite institutions, in my view, are failing at delivering the kind of liberal education that we should be striving for. Then I should say that even when we deliver the right kind of liberal education, we're still going to have people who are whose self-interest, whose lust for power, whose narrow vision fails to enact the ideals that they may even consciously embrace. There's a question about whether a liberal education makes you a more moral person, and that's tricky. I would hesitate to say that it does. That liberal education makes you more moral. I would say that liberal education makes you more conscious of the moral dimensions of your behavior. And that is pretty close, but not quite there. But it is a precondition for the kind of moral development and cultivation. You cannot get there without it, but having it doesn't get you there. But I guess the summary points to your answer is that our social problems would not be as entrenched and as pervasive as they are if we were doing liberal education democratically at a mass level. If we had a population that is better liberally educated, which means, of course, this is a gathering about higher education, but it does mean that it is urgent that we do liberal education at the primary and secondary and high school level. Absolutely necessary. And it's different what you do there, obviously, than what you do in college.
Oh, boy. Yes. Mariah Pursley is in the room sharing the microphone. Thanks, Mariah.
Hi, yes. I want to circle back to the end of your talk where you said that it's impossible to convince somebody of the value of the liberal education, which of course is our internal challenge, right?
With arguments.
With arguments, right? You have to demonstrate it, is what you said, and you talked about the high school students you work with, and it really resonated with me in that I feel that there's an extra step that we aren't always able to accomplish, and that is getting students themselves to articulate the value of what they've learned in their liberal education, and that articulation should be a part of that, built into the education itself, that they themselves can somehow articulate the transformative value, and that how they themselves can take it out into the world and deploy it. And I wonder if you have some insight into that critical piece that often happens. I mean, going back to Andy Del Blanco's talk about, it often happens later in life. It's not going to happen before graduation, but the space where we can have some influence on it is before that point of graduation.
Great. Yes, absolutely. Liberal education happens all over the place, and it happens without books. Sometimes there are people who can't read who are liberally educated. But if you're going to design an institution to do liberal education, there are good ways of doing it and bad ways of doing it. one of the, I think, necessary things of doing it is that liberal education is a self-conscious education. There is always a meta conversation happening in the classroom about what it is you're doing. The core course that I teach at Columbia, or that I've been teaching in the last number of years, is the sophomore course that all students take. It's a common curriculum, so all students, all sophomores are reading the same book at around the same time from September to May. So it's a 2-semester course, the same group of students with the same faculty member. The first book that we read there is Plato's Republic. So all the sophomores are reading Plato's Republic. So what's Plato's Republic about? It is largely about education, right? It's about organizing a republic that will, in Plato's view, demonstrate or give some insight into what the nature of justice. This republic that he imagines is divided into classes, not a democracy, right? Strict class divisions. And the kind of top class, the ruling class, not wealthy class, that separates wealth and power. The ruling class, the guardians, they're called. Most of the republic is about the education of the guardians, the education of the elite of society, the managers of society. So I'm teaching this book at Columbia, right? This is how it starts sophomore year. You have to immediately engage them in the fact that this is what we're doing here, that somehow you are at the top of a fiercely, brutally competitive heap. And this is the education that you're getting. This is what a tradition, a bunch of faculty members and institution has decided is the kind of education that we're going to give everybody. So let's think about that choice. Let's think about that decision. Let's engage critically with our own process of education. And I don't say that to, I was director for 10 years and I am a huge fan and an advocate of that program. I don't raise that question to undermine it and say this is not worth doing. I want them to think about what is worth doing and to measure their education against that standard. So I think that part of the liberal education is this self-conscious engagement with your own education. And that one other dimension of this is that if as a professor, what you're going there is and teaching the introductory level course to your discipline, you don't think of yourself as doing the work of liberal education. That's not the mentality. You can't engage the students in that conversation, because what you're doing is in fact not liberal education. What you're doing is disciplinary education, and that's illiberal just in the way that chemical engineering is. When you subordinate, or when you package disciplinary introductions as general education, you've given up the farm. Is that the expression? You've given up the game or something, thrown in the towel or something.
We have time for maybe 1.5 more questions. Lunch is ready, and I know everyone needs a break. So Aaron from Washington University has about 6 pages of single-spaced notes here. That's why I called on Aaron. I know a lot of people want to ask a question. Who thinks they ought to have their question heard? Nope. A professor of classics, Dan Berman from Temple University. There's a good argument.
That's right. You knew my discipline there. So right, I am a classicist, and I appreciate all the Plato and all of this.
From an Americanist, right?
Right. There you go.
But again, illustrating liberal education, right? I don't quote and you draw on Plato because I can read him in Greek or because I'm an expert. Just because Plato says things that matter to me as a human being and as an educator, right? That's general education.
Yeah. And I'd like to, my question kind of picks up on that a little bit, the metaphor, which I really think is an appropriate one that you ended with, again, on contagion and exposure as the medium, right, for kind of transmitting the liberal education. And I think it also harks back to what Professor Del Banco said about enthusiasm, right? In fact, that's right out of Plato, right?
Yeah.
And you kind of touched on this already in your answer to a moment ago, but I wouldn't mind you expanding on it a bit more. How you see that concept, right? That's that kind of spark, right, that you're talking about, play out in general education courses that aren't about literature, right? That aren't, you're not reading Plato, you're not reading the Iliad or Walden. You're talking about the chemistry of wine or something like that. Something that's supposed to have this kind of liberal education, undercurrent or meta discussion, but isn't really about that, for at least when the students are initially exposed to it. Just thoughts or kind of strategies or things that you've seen where that's worked, where that kind of enthusiastic spark is still there. But it's not because you're reading the Republic?
Yeah, great. That's a really great question, and it highlights what I take to be the most difficult curricular problem in general education or liberal education. Those terms, I like liberal better, but often use the terms interchangeably. The most difficult curricular problem in general education is the sciences. Not to be too provincial, but I've spent my whole career in academia at Columbia. But Columbia's core curriculum was established in 1919 and took essentially the form it has today by the mid-30s, with 2-year-long courses, one in literature, one in, roughly speaking, philosophical social thought, one semester in art, one semester in music. And it was those 4 courses until 2004 when a science course was added. Now that science course that was added in 2004, they've been talking about and trying to figure out a way to add a science course since 1919. And the course is the most problematic, it's the most difficult one, and it's the one that takes the most work to get right. And I could talk a lot about how that course works and the ways in which it works and the ways in which it doesn't. Part of the problem, part of the difficulty comes from the fact that science is taught so utterly as a specialized discipline. That is, scientists and science professors have not studied, I'm generalizing, obviously there are exceptions, but have not studied and do not conceive of their activity in liberal terms, as the pursuit of knowledge, as an activity that expresses the human curiosity and expresses kind of innate inclinations and innate curiosities and innate questions that human beings have. You need that to be able to teach science in that way. One kind of like, I don't know, motto or something that I often come back to is that liberal education is something that happens between people. Liberal education is not something that happens between books and people or between institutions and people. It's something that happens between people. And you need a faculty and an institutional structure that understands and values liberal education and offers a science-oriented liberal education. And of course, science and quantitative sciences have always been part of the liberal arts. That's how they were conceived, but they've been largely excluded today. You know, I mentioned here that I wanted to be a biologist. When I went to college as a freshman, I was very interested in books and ideas, but I was also very interested in biology. And I didn't know which I was going to do in college. And at Columbia, there was this quirky thing where to take first the entry-level biology, you have to take a year of chemistry first. And it's the general chemistry, the same course that pre-med students take. And that's graded on a curve and whatever, you know, it's, you know, probably. So I said, no, there's no way. I'm not going to spend a year in chemistry competing for a C with my pre-med colleagues so that then I can study biology, when at the same time I was taking literature humanities and having my mind blown. So there goes my life. But it's an example of how the fact that I did not have an option of studying science liberally. And I am certain that I would have gone for it in a serious way if that had been an option for me. And then God knows where that would have led me professionally. But anyway, we do the offering of science in a liberal way is extremely rare. I don't know if Melinda is going to talk about that aspect in the Cornerstones program, but one of the amazing things that the Cornerstone program has done is to provide students who are STEM majors with courses that look at their respective fields and interests in this kind of liberal humanistic way. Very hard to do, but really important.